Under Michigan law, guess who gets to make those designations? The legislature. It's the same pattern that we saw in 2020, and I'm going to lose my mind. Now, they give us more details on the construct of the NVRA, and they detail that only the legislature controls this in Michigan. Sorry, Jocelyn. Sorry, Whitmer.
Making sure that people are respected and protected under the law and that you can access health care when you need it, period.
Trump versus Governor Whitmer. Big Gretch Rona. Rona is trying to change the election rules as 2024 approaches, and Trump's election legal team is responding. Whitmer has filed a motion to dismiss the case Trump is pushing forward. We're going to read through the documents, but this is taking place out of the Western District of Michigan, and we're very familiar with Big Gretch Rona. She was the woman, the governor, who was part of the kidnapping hoax that ensnared a bunch of innocent men in a plot that never happened, that was orchestrated by the feds in order to create a white supremacy narrative that served them. But now she, in conjunction with Dana Nessel, who is the state AG, and in conjunction with the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, the three of them make up the Michigan Spice Girl team, and they hate Trump vociferously, and they're working hard to stop him. One thing that they've done is they've created these new voter registration agencies, and via executive order, Whitmer, in July, issued an executive order that would turn these entities, like the Department of Veterans Affairs and Small Business Administration and other government offices, would turn them into little Democrat voter registration offices via executive order. Now, she did it. She invoked federal law. She says, I have the right to do this. And they haven't done that since 1995 in Michigan. And so she's just saying we can do that right now. And then everybody that comes through there, they'll just register Democrat and they'll vote accordingly. So Trump's defense team and his election team filed suit. You see the RNC and Donald Trump for president, along with the Michigan Republican Party, all submitted this complaint. And now Governor Big Gretch Rona is trying to dismiss the case. But they tell us, all right, here's the intro. NVRA, which is, let's call it federal voting law, says that states can actually designate agencies for the registration of voters in elections for federal office. Okay, so the law says you can create these little registration offices. But guess what? We've seen this pattern before. Under Michigan law, guess who gets to make those designations? The legislature. It's the same pattern that we saw in 2020, and I'm going to lose my mind because it's the governors usurping the legislatures, which is what the Constitution, it's the body the Constitution gives the power to control the elections, is the legislature. And they make that clear. It's Constitution 1963, Article 2, Section 4, Subsection 2. It says the legislature shall enact laws to regulate the time, place, and manner of all nominations and elections and more, including a system of voter registration and absentee voting. So Michigan law says the legislature does this. Watch what Big Gretch Rona does in a minute. Now, the legislature exercised this authority when it enacted that law. It said, this is our prerogative. It also authorized the governor to provide a list to the Secretary of State designating executive departments, agencies, and others that will perform voter registration activities. However, that authority had to be exercised within a certain period of time, not later than the 30th day after the effective date of the law. That law became effective in 1995, okay? Under the plain language, it was effective in 1995. You don't now, Michigan Governor Rona, get to unilaterally designate VRAs, these voting registration agencies, whenever you want. Now, despite the absence of this authority, Big Gretch Rona, issued Executive Order 2023, ED 2023-6 on December 18, 2023, purporting to designate several state and federal agencies as VRAs. She also made the Department of Veteran Affairs, okay, a new voting registration agency. Now, these happen to be in like Detroit, Michigan, okay? They put them all in like ultra blue hotspots. We're going to name that one and that one and that one and that one. So everybody who comes in gets registered to vote. Here, vote for Kamala, vote for Kamala, vote for Kamala. Now, the Michigan legislature never granted her the authority to do this. They wrote the law. They said the Secretary of State is responsible for developing all these things and so on and so forth. Now, despite lacking the authority, the Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn, Spice Girl number 2, entered into a memo of understanding, okay? And those of you who've been with us since 2020, you're going to remember this like it's going to make your skin crawl. Same thing happened, okay? The Secretary of State enters into a private agreement and they say, well, we don't want to be sued. So the SBA is going to sue them. No, we don't want to be sued. So we enter into a settlement agreement. And via a settlement agreement, they say, sorry, it's binding. We did it. And the non-governmental party says it binds the government. And then the government says we're bound. Now, because the governor and the Secretary of State lack the authority to do this, hello, all of these designations appointments of VA and SBA offices as VRAs are ultra virus, out of scope. They're unlawful under Michigan law. They had no authority to do this, and Jocelyn Benson didn't have any authority to enter into that agreement. They did the same thing back during COVID, and we went through many cases that were exactly the same pattern. Some other entity would enter into an agreement with the Secretary of State, and they would say, my COVID, everything is COVID. And so all the rules would change. They're doing it here, but it's to a lesser extent. Now they're just creating VRA offices. Now, moreover, because these unauthorized actions are not lawful designations, they are not lawfully operating, and she doesn't care. So they filed a complaint. Now, Rona, Big Gretch, has moved to dismiss the complaint. Trump's defense is responding. Trump is responding to Rona. She's trying to get rid of the case. She filed a motion to dismiss. Trump's people say, no, we have valid standing here. They say the RNC and Trump and all of us respond to this from Whitmer, Benson, and the others. They say her motion should be held, her motion to dismiss should be denied. In their motion to dismiss, Rona, Gretch, they frame themselves as the standard bearers for voting rights of Michigan veterans. Well, we're just trying to help the veterans get registered to vote. You don't hate the veterans, do you, Rob? Yet the state defendants argue that there's a lack of standing. They say if democracy requires broad and fair access to the franchise, it also requires broad and fair access to the courthouse. So if you want them to file their claim, you got to let us file their claim. And the court should reject their approach. In just the last few months, they have tried, the state, to significantly change Michigan election law under the guise of a manual, right? They didn't change the law. This was the other sneaky thing that they did. They didn't change any laws. They just wrote a new manual. And in the manual tells them how to actually conduct the election. And the manual is filled with election rigging by Democrats. And this has been litigated. They also sought to immediately enact administrative rules that would limit recounts, even though the legislation won't take effect until months after the election. They resisted on mootness and standing grounds. They've taken extraordinary measures to keep Trump off the ballot. All of this while we've got a major border crisis that's going to result in many ineligible people casting ballots. Now, they try to shield themselves from any inquiry here. They say, what about the 11th Amendment, which is the immunity provision, right? States cannot be sued except in certain circumstances, when Congress says they can, when states waive it, or when there is an exception. And the exception is when a government official is doing their own wrongdoing, right? So in this case, they're not really suing the state. They're trying to stop a government official from doing a bad thing. It's more like an injunction. And plaintiffs are not asking, here you go, the federal court to enjoin the state. They've articulated that these actions are ongoing violations of federal law too, so they can't use the 11th Amendment to claim immunity from this action. Now, here's what actually matters, okay? The NVRA, the federal law, requires that states do designate VRAs and gives them the ability to do that. But it doesn't tell states how to make those designations. That's left up to state law. So it says you do this, but then the states decide how. So it's a question of Michigan law. And under Michigan law, authority to designate VRAs is held by the legislature. Gretch can't do it. No Michigan executive branch official has even attempted to do this since 1995 because that governor acted under authority from the legislature, but that expired. These new VRAs coincided with an executive order from Biden that directed agencies to partner, right? So then Biden is endorsing this, saying, let's have the federal government and local state governments become our voter registration agencies for our own party. And so she's like, well, I just went along with this. But when the Michigan governor and the Secretary of State designated these new agencies, they acted beyond their authority. They violated the law. And so this needs to be stopped. The prior governor followed the rule, but that was done. When he made these designations, that was the end of it. Then in May 2022, Gretch Rona Whitmer issued Executive Order 2022-4, which noted that Michigan's list of designated voter registration agencies has not been updated in a long time. She said, well, this hasn't been updated, so I think we should update it. Then in September of 2023, the Secretary of State, Jocelyn, acted on those recommendations, and she entered into an interagency agreement with the Department of Veteran Affairs to designate the department, the VA Medical Center, the Detroit Medical Center, the Detroit Regional Office as voter registration sites. Isn't that convenient? So all the ultra blue lib super centers get these government-funded registration agencies. Isn't that convenient? Finally, then, they also designated the SBA as a voter registration agencies. Now, both federal agencies were designated as, quote, subject to the agreement that they signed with Michigan. But both those actions ignore the law. Only the governor can designate these things, and no later than 30 days after the law was implemented, which was back in 1995. The Michigan legislature never granted the Secretary of of State any power to do this. It makes the Secretary of State responsible for only developing mail registration forms and other things. But she doesn't have the power to do that now. So we filed this lawsuit. We're now asking you to stop them from doing this. The RNC represents 30 million registered Republicans in 50 states. Many people are interested in this. In November, RNC candidates are going to appear on the ballots here. Plaintiff Trump is also suing. Michigan Republican Party's also suing. Plaintiff is a local kid. And so we've met all the standards here. We have standing. Getting standing right is important, especially in election cases, because elections ensure democratic health. If you have too strict of standing rules, nobody can get into court. Here, Rona argues that we have no factual support, but that's not the standard. The court examines whether we have made our claim, and we have pled cognizable injuries here. One means of satisfying the standard is by showing there could be economic injury. And so we have cognizable injuries here, so we have standing. We also have associational standing and more. And the 11th Amendment does not bar Gretch Rona either from being charged here with what we're claiming. To determine whether we can bring this claim against Rona, we ask ourselves a pretty straightforward question: whether the complaint alleges an ongoing violation of federal law and seeks relief. So here, pretty simple. We only need to show that we're suing state officials, we're not suing the state, which they're doing, alleging an ongoing violation of federal law and seeking prospective relief. And they say we're doing that. That's exactly what we've done. We've sued 3 state officials in their official capacities. We're saying that their designation of the VRAs violates federal law and the APA, and plaintiffs request prospective relief to stop this. We want an injunction stopping them from making these things VRAs. We acknowledge that, yeah, we can't sue the state, but that's not what we're talking about. We're suing these officials for violating federal law. Now, they give us more details on the construct of the NVRA, and they detail that only the legislature controls this in Michigan. Sorry, Jocelyn. Sorry, Whitmer. Under the Constitution, the legislature conducts this. It's vested in a governor, but the governor doesn't have the power to make the laws. The legislature does. The Michigan legislature adopted the laws to comport with the NVRA passed by Congress, specifically defining designated voter registration agencies as follows, and expressly designated numerous agencies. It makes no mention, the law, of the governor's authority to designate VRAs, and there is no power after this date. It was a one-ended authority, one-time permission to make these decisions, and that's it. And now when a voter registration application is submitted, then they have to do a bunch of things, right, to actually process the registration form. And they did it with intentionality. Now, in other words, if you create a VRA, there are consequences for that. The legislature has to pay for it. We've got a bunch of stuff that needs to be, we got to pick the ballots up from there, registrations going on there. You can't just create new offices out of thin air. In other words, the legislature creates the structure and then the executive branch enforces the law. So they're just creating a bunch of new entities usurping the legislature. So Gretch Rona acted outside the law when she tried to do this. For almost 3 decades, there were no attempts to designate any other agencies, but then Rona came in and just did it. She concluded, it's time to review and update Michigan's list. And so she did it. This appears to have been inspired by Biden, who is also changing this at a national level. Well, let's just use federal funds and U.S. taxpayer dollars to buttress the Democratic get out the vote operations. Whitmer issued another executive order and then implemented it. Here's the bottom line. Whitmer's attempts to designate these as VRAs violate both Michigan law and federal law, and they're exercising improper legislative authority. They're not Congress. Michigan says the legislature has the power to do that. The executive power is to enforce or effectuate the laws that the legislature creates, and thus the governor lacks the authority to make these laws, but she's doing it. While the governor has the power to enforce the laws that the legislature passes, she cannot change or extend them, but she's doing that. It's outside the scope. Same thing happened here. The Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, is not allowed to do this. She and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, all right, 2 big government lefty interested groups, they get together, they say, we're going to sign an interagency agreement, and we're going to designate the Saginaw VA Medical Center, Detroit VA, Detroit Regional as agencies and offices. So just Democrat registration supercenters. The Michigan Department of State press release said that the official designation of VA as a voter registration site will come through executive order in the coming weeks. And then they did it using our funds. Now, the purpose section of the MOA without the legislature's authority as well. Consistent with Michigan state constitutional arrangement, the legislature has the ability to do this. Secretary of State is responsible for these other things. Nothing in her power allows her to do this, but she did it. And the conclusion is that they are prohibited from supplying provisions. They can't do stuff that the legislature didn't say they can do. Now, the fact is, the legislature has not granted Jocelyn Benson the authority to do any of this, and they're violating federal law. There is nothing established at all about a Michigan governor like Rona dusting off off a 28-year-old executive order that none of her predecessors had ever invoked, and then using it in 2024. Designating VRAs in this manner, particularly when every other VRAs came from statutory authority from the legislature, is not a series of steps in a regularly, orderly, definite way. It's completely ad hoc. She's making it up as she goes along. So is their contract with the SBA. This whole thing came from Biden's executive order. Now, each state shall establish procedures. That's right, shall. And we have them. It comes from the legislature. They have been established. It's not discretionary, so she doesn't have the ability to just change it up. And so the legislature makes these decisions, and we have standing to bring this claim. Confidence in the integrity of our electoral process is essential to the functioning of our democracy. The unlawful actions of Michigan Governor Rona and Secretary of State Benson and the federal defendants undermine that confidence. The state defendants had no authority to designate any of these as VRAs, and for the reasons explained above, and their attempt to do so, it's a continuing violation of both state and federal law. That is likely why they're urging this court to dismiss based on standing and immunity rather than on the merits. They know both those arguments are unavailing. So deny their requests and let this case move forward. Signed by election lawyers Jonathan B. Koch and Gary Lakowski from the Dillon Law Group and our friends at Smith, Haughey, Rice, and Roge. Good to see a nice filing there, but Michigan is so corrupt. As we mentioned, the three ladies there are doing everything they can to permutate around the margins. Now, here was Rona speaking about some of this.
Making sure that people are respected and protected under the law and that you can access health care when you need it, period.
Whitmer's visit Sunday was to promote the Harris-Walz campaign's Fighting for Reproductive Freedom bus tour. The tour is set to make at least 50 stops in key battleground states before November's election to advocate for reproductive rights. Guest speaker Laurel Marcinkus shared her experience with abortion and advocated against what Democrats say is a national ban if Trump is elected president again.
The situation was so severe.
Okay, so a national ban, I think they're a little bit delusional because Trump has not ever said anything like that. So they're living in their own bizarre minds. Not much we can do about it.